In 1783, the United States achieved independence. It also lost its shield. For more than a century, American merchant ships had sailed under British protection. They were colonial vessels, yes, taxed, regulated, often resented, but guarded. The Royal Navy's shadow stretched across the Atlantic and into the Mediterranean. When American ships carried tobacco, rice, flour, timber, or whale oil, they carried something else too: deterrence. Independence stripped that away overnight. The Continental Navy, which had fought desperately during the Revolution, was dismantled after the war. It wasn't defeated, it was simply too expensive. The young republic was buried in debt. Congress had no reliable power to tax. The states argued constantly. Standing navies were seen by many as tools of tyranny, instruments monarchies used to project dominance and drain treasuries. So the ships were sold. The sailors dispersed, the cannons rusted, and the United States became a commercial nation with no teeth. For a few years, the vulnerability wasn't obvious. American merchants were eager. The war was over. Trade routes reopened. New markets beckoned. Europe still needed American grain. The Caribbean still needed lumber. Southern Europe needed salted fish and flour. But the Mediterranean was different. The southern coast, stretching from Morocco to Tripoli, operated under a system that Americans barely understood. The so-called Barbary states, Algiers, Tunis, Tripoli, and Morocco, functioned within the orbit of the Ottoman Empire, though with varying degrees of autonomy. Their economies relied heavily on maritime predation. European powers called it piracy. The rulers of those states called it policy. Ships that entered the Mediterranean without treaties were fair game. Crews were captured. Cargo was seized. Passengers were held for ransom. Governments paid tribute for protection. It was less chaos than calculation. For centuries, European nations had dealt with this through negotiation and payment. Tribute was expensive, but war was unpredictable. Britain paid. France paid. Spain paid. Smaller nations paid more. It was part of doing business in those waters. Before independence, American ships were covered by British agreements. After 1783, they were not, and the Barbary corsairs noticed. The first shock came in 1785. Two American merchant vessels, the Maria and the Dauphin, were captured by Algerian corsairs. Their crews were imprisoned. Letters began arriving from North Africa, describing chains, forced labor, uncertainty. Families back home panicked. The United States had no navy to send. It had no treasury capable of absorbing large ransom demands. It had no leverage. Diplomats were dispatched instead. Thomas Jefferson, then minister to France, and John Adams, minister to Britain, attempted negotiation. They discovered something unsettling. Tribute wasn't symbolic, it was structured. The rulers of Algiers and Tripoli demanded ships, gold, gunpowder, annual payments. Not one-time ransoms, but ongoing arrangements. The numbers stunned American envoys. The United States, barely solvent, was being asked to purchase peace at a price it could scarcely afford. Jefferson was disturbed by the logic of it. He believed paying tribute would invite endless demands. Adams, more cautious, feared war the country could not win. The debate wasn't abstract. American sailors were sitting in cells while the Republic argued philosophy. Back home, the Confederation Congress struggled even to fund basic government functions. There was no centralized taxation power. Revenue depended on voluntary state contributions, which arrived inconsistently. Funding a navy felt like a fantasy. So the question hardened. Was the United States willing to fight for its commerce, or would it purchase safety? In 1786, Jefferson met with the ambassador of Tripoli in London. He asked directly why American ships were being attacked. The answer was blunt. It was their right. Non-Muslim nations without treaties were lawful targets under their interpretation of long-standing practice. Tribute was the price of peace. Refusal meant war. Jefferson left the meeting with clarity. The Mediterranean wasn't lawless. It operated under a system. A brutal one, but coherent. And the United States was outside it. Meanwhile, the captured sailors waited. Some were forced into labor. Some converted to Islam, voluntarily or under pressure. Some died in captivity. American newspapers began printing accounts that stirred anger among the public. But outrage does not build fleets. Money does. And money was scarce. When the Constitution was ratified in 1788, it changed the equation. The new federal government possessed taxation authority. It could raise revenue directly. It could build institutions. It could, in theory, fund a navy. But theory moved slower than events. In 1793, Algerian corsairs captured 11 more American ships. Over 100 sailors were enslaved. Insurance rates for Mediterranean voyages skyrocketed. American trade in the region nearly collapsed. The crisis forced action. In 1794, Congress passed the Naval Act, authorizing the construction of 6 frigates. They were designed to be powerful, larger and more heavily armed than typical European frigates, capable of outrunning ships of the line and overpowering lighter vessels. It was a defensive investment disguised as prudence. But even that decision came with hesitation. The act contained a clause. If peace were reached with Algiers, construction could be halted. America still wasn't sure whether it wanted a navy or simply leverage in negotiation. While the ships were being built, diplomacy continued. In 1795, the United States reached a treaty with Algiers. It agreed to pay substantial tribute, cash, naval stores, even a frigate. American prisoners were released. Peace was purchased. Similar agreements followed with Tripoli and Tunis. For a brief moment, stability returned. American ships sailed again in the Mediterranean, under treaty protection. Captured sailors came home. The crisis seemed contained. But the arrangement carried a psychological cost. The United States, born in rebellion against taxation without representation, was now paying protection money to foreign rulers. It was a bitter irony. Some leaders considered it pragmatic statecraft. Others saw it as humiliation deferred. The Navy, meanwhile, continued construction. The 6 frigates, including what would become the USS Constitution, USS United States, and USS Constellation, were nearing completion. They represented more than ships. They represented a choice postponed. Would America remain a commercial republic protected by payments, or become a maritime power capable of enforcing its own security? As the century turned, tensions resurfaced. Tripoli's ruler, the Pasha Yusuf Karamanli, watched American payments carefully. Tribute was not a static arrangement. It was negotiable, upward. When he believed the United States had not met expectations, he demanded more. In 1801, after failed negotiations, he made a symbolic move with practical consequences. He ordered the flagpole at the American consulate in Tripoli cut down. Under diplomatic custom, this was a declaration of war. The United States, barely 2 decades old, found itself facing an overseas conflict not for territory, not for ideology, but for commerce, leverage, and credibility. The disarmament of 1783 had saved money. It had also invited testing. Now the question was no longer theoretical. Could the United States defend its interests beyond its coastline? Or would it remain, in the eyes of older powers, a republic rich in goods but poor in force? The answer would begin to unfold in the waters of the Mediterranean, and the nation would discover that independence, once won, must be maintained, not just declared. The Barbary system was not chaos, it was infrastructure. From the Atlantic edge of Morocco to the shores of Tripoli, the North African regencies operated a maritime economy built on capture. European observers called it piracy because that was the language available to them. But piracy implies randomness, rogue captains chasing opportunistic plunder. This was something else. Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli treated corsairing as state policy. Ships sailed under government commission. Crews operated with official sanction. Captured vessels were processed through bureaucratic channels. Human beings became inventory. There were price schedules. Ransom rates differed by nationality. Skilled sailors were valued differently from passengers. Officers commanded higher sums. Wealthy civilians could expect negotiation. The poor were often sold into labor. It was brutal. It was also organized. Algiers stood at the center of it. The harbor functioned as both marketplace and warning. European captives were paraded through public squares. Letters were encouraged, descriptions of chains, of heat, of forced labor in quarries or shipyards. Those letters traveled back across the Mediterranean like advertising. Fear was part of the model. If your government paid tribute, your ships sailed safely. If it delayed, ships disappeared. Insurance companies in London and Marseille calculated risk not in morality, but in probability. Governments ran cost analyses, annual tribute versus naval deployment. More often than not, tribute was cheaper, so the system persisted. Britain negotiated, France negotiated, Spain negotiated. Even powerful states found it easier to transfer gold than to sustain permanent Mediterranean squadrons. Warships required sailors, provisions, maintenance, and political will. Tribute required a treasury. And so, Europe fed the machine. For centuries, this arrangement functioned because the balance made sense. The Barbary states lacked the capacity to challenge great powers directly. They could not invade Europe. They could not contest empires at sea. But they could intercept commerce. They could inflict irritation, embarrassment, and economic disruption. It was asymmetrical leverage long before the term existed. The corsairs were fast. Their ships, xebecs and galleys, were designed for Mediterranean conditions. They relied on surprise, speed, and numbers. A lightly armed merchantman was a target. A convoy without escort was an invitation. And because European powers were perpetually entangled in wars with one another, maintaining unified pressure against North Africa rarely lasted. When Britain fought France, Mediterranean patrols thinned. When Spain faced internal crisis, tribute negotiations shifted. The Barbary rulers understood fragmentation. they exploited it. Religion provided justification, but economics sustained the practice. The language of holy war appeared in diplomatic exchanges, yet tribute payments were denominated in cash, naval stores, cannons, even warships. Ideology framed the system. Revenue fueled it. In Algiers, captured ships were auctioned, crews were ransomed or assigned labor. European governments established redemption funds and religious orders dedicated to negotiating release of captives. Entire bureaucracies in Europe existed to deal with North African captivity. It was normalized, which is what made America's reaction complicated. The United States had inherited none of Europe's diplomatic channels, none of its established relationships, and none of its naval power. It entered the Mediterranean as a new actor, commercially ambitious but politically inexperienced. And new actors pay entry fees. When American ships began appearing after 1783, the Barbary regencies saw opportunity. Here was a trading nation without a navy. No treaties, no tribute, no escorts. The calculus required no emotion. Capture. In 1785, when Algerian corsairs seized the Maria and the Dauphin, it was not a statement about American ideology. It was enforcement of a regional norm. No treaty, no immunity. The American public, however, did not interpret it that way. Newspapers printed lists of captured sailors. Ministers preached about Christians enslaved by Muslim rulers. Families organized petitions. The emotional charge was immediate. But across the Atlantic, the rulers of Algiers saw nothing extraordinary. A new nation had entered their waters. Negotiation would follow, or resistance. Either outcome had precedent. American diplomats quickly discovered that tribute was not a one-time transaction. It resembled subscription pricing. Initial payment secured release of prisoners and short-term peace. Annual installments maintained it. Gifts to rulers marked anniversaries. Naval supplies sweetened agreements. Delays triggered threats. Failure invited capture. The numbers were staggering for a country still stabilizing its currency. Algiers demanded hundreds of thousands of dollars, an enormous sum for a republic struggling to pay Revolutionary War debts. The irony was sharp. A nation founded in protest against imperial taxation was now considering foreign tribute. Jefferson believed paying would encourage further demands. He argued that force, though expensive initially, would ultimately prove cheaper and more dignified. Adams feared war costs would spiral beyond control. The United States had neither fleet nor experience in Mediterranean operations. Both men understood something larger was at stake: reputation. If America paid easily, other states might test it. If it resisted and failed, credibility would collapse. If it resisted and succeeded, it would alter its own trajectory. The decision wasn't merely financial, it was identity-shaping. Meanwhile, in Algiers, captivity was not symbolic suffering. American prisoners labored in shipyards and quarries. Some wrote letters describing disease, heat, hunger, and chains. Others adapted. A few converted to Islam, sometimes sincerely, sometimes strategically. Survival created moral gray zones. Back in the United States, stories of enslavement circulated widely. They struck at a young nation already entangled in its own contradictions about slavery. Southern politicians who defended chattel slavery at home denounced North African enslavement abroad. The tension was visible. Freedom, it turned out, was geographically selective. In 1793, the crisis intensified. Algerian corsairs captured 11 American ships in a single season. Insurance rates exploded. Mediterranean commerce nearly ceased. Merchants pressured Congress aggressively. The economic impact moved the issue from abstract diplomacy to domestic urgency. The system in North Africa was functioning exactly as designed. Target vulnerability, generate leverage, extract payment. And the United States, lacking naval deterrence, fit the vulnerability profile perfectly. European powers watched quietly. They had navigated this system for centuries. Some paid, some threatened, some did both. None were surprised by America's predicament. A commercial republic without maritime force was an anomaly in the Mediterranean. Trade requires protection. Protection requires ships. Ships require sustained political commitment. The United States had attempted to skip the middle step. Now, reality was correcting the omission. When Congress passed the Naval Act of 1794, authorizing 6 frigates, it wasn't simply building ships. It was entering the Mediterranean equation. The design of those frigates reflected intention. They were larger than standard frigates, heavily armed, built to survive in contested waters. Naval architect Joshua Humphreys envisioned vessels that could outrun ships of the line, yet overpower typical frigates. They were strategic compromises in timber and iron. But even as construction began, diplomacy with Algiers succeeded in securing a treaty in 1795. Tribute was agreed upon. Prisoners were released. One of the newly constructed ships was transferred as part of payment. Peace, temporarily, was restored. Which meant the racket continued, just with America as a paying participant. The deeper truth remained unaddressed. Tribute does not eliminate leverage. It redistributes it. As long as American commerce flowed through the Mediterranean under purchased protection, the regencies retained influence. Any dispute could reopen capture season. Any delay in payment could trigger seizures. It was stability built on compliance. Some American leaders considered it prudent engagement in a complicated region. Others saw it as dependency disguised as diplomacy. The Mediterranean racket had absorbed a new customer. But customers sometimes reconsider their contracts, and when they do, the system reacts. The tension was building, methodically, waiting for a moment when tribute would no longer feel tolerable, and force would feel inevitable. Peace, when purchased, feels stable at first. Ships sail again, insurance rates settle, merchants exhale. But under tribute, peace is conditional, and conditions shift. By the late 1790s, the United States had treaties with Algiers, Tripoli, and Tunis. Payments flowed across the Atlantic in the form of gold, naval stores, cannons, even completed ships. American diplomats became familiar with ceremonial gift-giving. Annual installments were scheduled. Negotiations continued in polite language. On paper, it worked. In reality, it bled. The young republic was still managing Revolutionary War debt. Domestic politics were volatile. Federalists and Democratic Republicans fought over the size and scope of government. Some believed naval expansion was essential to national survival. Others feared it would create permanent militarization and centralized power. The Barbary tribute issue sat directly inside that ideological fracture. Was naval force a necessary tool of sovereignty, or the first step toward empire? President George Washington had approached the problem cautiously. He supported naval construction, but avoided escalation. His successor, John Adams, faced even greater financial strain. The quasi-war with France in the late 1790s required American ships to protect Atlantic trade from French privateers. Resources were already stretched. Paying North African tribute felt like buying quiet in one region while fighting in another. It was triage diplomacy. Adams understood something uncomfortable. A two-front maritime conflict would overwhelm the United States. The Navy was still young. Officers were gaining experience, but operational depth was limited. Shipyards could not replace losses quickly. Training sailors took time. Tribute bought time. And sometimes, time is the most valuable commodity. But time also amplifies resentment. American newspapers increasingly framed the payments as humiliation. The idea that a republic founded on resistance to imperial coercion was now transferring wealth to foreign rulers grated on public pride. The language sharpened. Protection money, extortion, national disgrace. Yet the alternatives were not abstract. War meant casualties. It meant lost ships. It meant expanded federal spending and possibly higher taxes, precisely what many Americans distrusted. The country was discovering a pattern that would repeat across centuries. Ideals are clear in principle, murky in budget form. Meanwhile, in Tripoli, Yusuf Karamanli watched closely. He was ambitious, younger than many of his counterparts, eager to assert authority. Tribute arrangements were not static contracts. They were leverage instruments. If he believed the United States had paid Algiers more generously, he could demand parity. If he sensed hesitation, he could escalate. Diplomacy in North Africa was competitive. Each ruler wanted favorable terms relative to the others. American envoys were constantly navigating comparative demands. And comparison breeds inflation. In 1800, tensions with Tripoli increased. The Pasha demanded additional payments beyond what had been agreed. American diplomats resisted. They believed the treaty terms were clear. Tripoli insisted they were flexible. Flexible, in this context, meant upward. Inside the United States, political leadership was shifting. The election of 1800 brought Thomas Jefferson to the presidency. For years, he had argued that paying tribute encouraged dependency. He believed naval force, though initially costly, would end the cycle. But Jefferson was also wary of standing armies and permanent militarization. He favored smaller government, limited federal power, fiscal restraint. His philosophy required a delicate balance: defend national interests without constructing the very apparatus he distrusted. The Mediterranean would test that balance. Upon taking office in 1801, Jefferson inherited the tribute system. Payments were still due. Captives had been released under prior treaties. Commerce flowed again. But the underlying structure had not changed. The United States was still renting security. Yusuf Karamanli chose to accelerate the confrontation. In May 1801, frustrated by what he perceived as insufficient payment, he made a theatrical move. He ordered the American flagstaff outside the U.S. consulate in Tripoli cut down. In diplomatic practice, this was unmistakable. War. No formal declaration, no negotiated escalation, just a severed pole and a clear signal. The United States had been paying for peace. Now, it was being asked to pay more or fight. Jefferson faced his first major foreign policy test. He did not request a formal declaration of war from Congress. Instead, he ordered a squadron of American warships to the Mediterranean. Their mission? Protect commerce, apply pressure, and respond to aggression. It was a measured escalation. Not invasion, not conquest. Presence. The frigates authorized years earlier were now active instruments of policy. Ships like the USS President, USS Philadelphia, and USS Essex crossed the Atlantic with a mixture of uncertainty and determination. They were sailing into a system that had functioned for centuries, and they were doing so without full clarity about how it would end. The price of peace had shifted. No longer denominated solely in gold, it would now be measured in risk. American officers quickly discovered that Mediterranean operations were complex. Coastal waters favored corsairs familiar with geography. Harbors were fortified. Weather patterns differed from Atlantic routes. Intelligence was inconsistent. This was not a theater the United States knew well. At the same time, the American public watched closely. Many supported resistance to tribute. Others worried about open-ended conflict. The country had never fought an overseas war independent of European alliances. This would be its first test as a self-directed maritime power. The stakes were larger than Tripoli. If America succeeded, it would signal that the Republic could defend its commerce globally. If it failed, tribute payments might increase, not decrease. Reputation, once again, hovered over the calculations. Inside Tripoli, the Pasha likely believed he held advantage. The United States was distant. Its navy was small. Its domestic politics were divided. European powers had long paid tribute rather than wage sustained war. Why should America be different? From his perspective, escalation was rational. Pressure produces payment. It had worked before. But something subtle had changed since 1785. The United States now possessed ships built specifically to avoid dependency. Its officers had gained experience during the quasi-war with France. Its political leadership, though divided, understood that national credibility was at stake. The nation without teeth was beginning to grow some. Not a fleet capable of dominating the Mediterranean, not yet, but enough to complicate the old calculations. Tribute had purchased temporary quiet. War would test permanence. And in the waters off Tripoli, two systems were about to collide. One built on extracting payment through calibrated threat. The other built on proving it would not pay indefinitely. Neither side fully understood how far the conflict would go. But both believed the other would eventually blink. History tends to punish miscalculations of resolve. Jefferson did not crave war. He distrusted standing militaries. He distrusted executive overreach. He distrusted permanent entanglements abroad. His political identity had been forged in opposition to concentrated power. And yet, within months of taking office, he was dispatching warships across the Atlantic. Not because he desired confrontation, but because tribute had reached its ceiling. When news arrived that Tripoli had effectively declared war, Jefferson responded without theatrical outrage. He understood something fundamental. If the United States retreated now, every other Barbary ruler would test the limits. Payment would not stabilize the system. It would inflate it. So he chose demonstration. He sent a squadron of frigates to the Mediterranean in 1801 under Commodore Richard Dale. Their instructions were restrained. Protect American shipping. Show force. Avoid unnecessary escalation. seek negotiation if possible. It was a careful line to walk. Too soft, and Tripoli would interpret it as weakness. Too aggressive, and the United States might trigger wider conflict before it was prepared. The ships arrived to a theater that did not operate on American timetables. Tripoli's corsairs continued raiding. Coastal batteries were reinforced. European observers watched with curiosity. Would the young republic sustain the pressure? Or would it, like so many others, return to payment after a few sharp exchanges? The first months were inconclusive. American ships blockaded intermittently, but blockades require proximity, supplies, coordination. The Mediterranean summer was punishing. Disease circulated easily in cramped quarters. Naval warfare was as much endurance as engagement, and endurance is expensive. Back in Washington, Jefferson faced constitutional scrutiny. Congress had not formally declared war. Critics questioned executive authority. Supporters argued that defending commerce fell within presidential responsibility. The debate revealed something larger. The United States had never defined the boundaries of overseas military action. Independence had been continental. The Revolution had been territorial. Now the Republic was testing maritime projection, without precedent. The Navy, meanwhile, was learning in real time. Mediterranean navigation required adaptation. Shallow waters near Tripoli favored smaller corsair vessels. American frigates were powerful but less maneuverable in confined spaces. Intelligence about enemy movements was often outdated by the time it arrived. This was not a theater of decisive fleet battles. It was attrition and signaling requires patience. By 1802, command passed to Commodore Richard Morris. His tenure exposed the fragility of early American naval administration. Discipline slackened. Coordination faltered. Morris was criticized for inaction and eventually recalled. The lesson was painful but clarifying. Ships alone do not produce results. Leadership does. The United States was discovering the human cost of institutional infancy. A navy only a few years old did not yet possess standardized doctrine. Officers were talented but inexperienced in sustained foreign deployment. Logistical support across an ocean was improvised. Tripoli sensed hesitation. Corsair raids continued. Jefferson responded by appointing Commodore Edward Preble in 1803. Preble brought sharper discipline and clearer objectives. Under his command, the American squadron adopted a more aggressive blockade strategy. But aggression increases exposure, and exposure carries risk. In October 1803, that risk materialized. The USS Philadelphia, under Captain William Bainbridge, pursued a Tripolitan vessel too close to shore. In unfamiliar waters, the frigate struck an uncharted reef. Grounded, immobile, within range of enemy guns. Efforts to lighten the ship failed. Cannons were thrown overboard. The crew attempted desperate maneuvers to free her. None succeeded. Tripolitan gunboats closed in. Surrounded, unable to maneuver, Bainbridge surrendered to prevent slaughter. 300 American sailors were taken prisoner. The Philadelphia, one of the most formidable ships in the American Navy, was captured intact. It was a catastrophe. Not simply a tactical loss, but a symbolic one. A tribute-paying nation could excuse humiliation under economic necessity. A fighting nation losing a frigate to grounding and capture invited mockery. Tripoli celebrated. The captured ship was refloated and anchored in the harbor. its guns now potentially aimed at its former owners. The prisoners were confined, bargaining chips in future negotiation. For the United States, the loss transformed the war's tone. What had been a limited show of force became a test of resolve. Jefferson faced pressure. Critics questioned competence. Supporters demanded retaliation. The Navy, still young, had suffered a public wound. How it responded would shape its identity. Preble understood the stakes. Allowing the Philadelphia to remain operational under Tripolitan control was unacceptable. Not only would it strengthen the Pasha's defenses, it would signal American impotence. The decision was made to destroy the ship. The plan was audacious. Lieutenant Stephen Decatur, barely in his mid-20s, volunteered to lead a small party into Tripoli harbor under cover of darkness. Using a captured ketch disguised as a merchant vessel, the team would approach the anchored frigate, board her, overwhelm the guards, and set her ablaze. It was not a battle, it was surgical humiliation. In February 1804, Decatur executed the mission with precision. His men silently boarded the Philadelphia, drove off defenders in close combat, and ignited combustibles below deck. Flames spread rapidly. The boarding party escaped before the ship's magazines exploded, illuminating the harbor in violent light. The captured frigate burned to the waterline. The psychological effect was immediate. European observers praised the daring. Even British Admiral Horatio Nelson reportedly called it one of the boldest acts of the age. For the United States, the raid rebalanced narrative momentum. The Navy had stumbled. Now it had struck back. But destruction alone does not win wars. Preble intensified bombardments of Tripoli throughout 1804. Gunboats engaged in close-range fighting. Casualties mounted on both sides. The American squadron demonstrated persistence, yet coastal fortifications remained intact. The Pasha endured. Blockades restrict supply, but they rarely collapse regimes quickly, especially ones accustomed to siege. The conflict settled into strain. American sailors endured heat, disease, and repetitive engagement. Tripoli absorbed bombardment but maintained defiance. Prisoners from the Philadelphia remained captive, reminders of unfinished business. Jefferson's calculated risk was evolving. He had refused tribute escalation. He had chosen force. But force demanded stamina, financial, political, and human. The United States was no longer asking whether it would pay. It was asking how much it would endure to avoid paying. And endurance, like tribute, carries a price. By 1804, the war had become intimate. Not in grand fleet formations or decisive naval clashes, but in the slow grind of proximity. American ships lingered off Tripoli's coast for months at a time. The Mediterranean sun bleached canvas and skin alike. Water grew stale. Salt hardened into crust along railings and boots. Sailors learned the rhythms of a foreign shoreline they could see but not yet control. Blockade is a peculiar kind of warfare. It lacks spectacle. It offers no dramatic surrender scenes. Instead, it functions as pressure, incremental, suffocating, designed to wear down rather than shatter. Preble's squadron harassed coastal defenses, intercepted vessels, and bombarded fortifications when weather permitted. Gunboats darted forward in close engagements that felt more like knife fights than naval maneuvers. The Americans were learning something crucial. Mediterranean combat did not reward impatience. Tripoli's harbour was shallow and treacherous. Shore batteries were strategically placed. Corsair vessels hugged coastline and retreated under cannon protection. Every approach carried risk of grounding, crossfire, or encirclement. The United States possessed heavier guns. Tripoli possessed geography. And geography, when paired with patience, is formidable. The captured sailors from the Philadelphia remained confined in the city. Their captivity was a constant moral weight. Negotiations for ransom continued intermittently, but the Pasha understood leverage. Prisoners were bargaining chips, not humanitarian obligations. The American public followed developments through letters and newspaper dispatches that arrived weeks or months after events. War at distance creates temporal distortion. By the time readers reacted to one engagement, another had already occurred. In Washington, Jefferson maintained measured resolve. He avoided dramatic declarations. Instead, he continued funding the squadron, rotating commanders when necessary, and pressing Congress for support without invoking expansionist rhetoric. This was not conquest. It was correction, or so he framed it. But correction proved elusive. Bombardments damaged Tripoli's defenses but did not collapse them. The Pasha refused capitulation. Tribute was still implicitly on the table, though rebranded as ransom or indemnity. Diplomacy flickered alongside cannon fire. And then the war shifted terrain. William Eaton, a former American consul familiar with North African politics, proposed a different strategy. Tripoli's ruler, Yusuf Karamanli, had seized power years earlier by overthrowing his brother, Hamet. Eaton believed Hamet could be restored with American support. It was a risky idea. Instead of battering the harbor indefinitely, the United States could support regime change from within. If Hamet reclaimed the throne, he might negotiate favorable terms and release prisoners without tribute escalation. Jefferson authorized limited cooperation, not full invasion, not colonial occupation, but assistance. Thus, the war expanded from maritime blockade to land campaign. In early 1805, Eaton embarked on a desert march that bordered on improbable. Accompanied by a small detachment of U.S. Marines under Lieutenant Presley O'Bannon, a handful of naval officers, and a fluctuating force of mercenaries and local allies, he moved westward from Alexandria across harsh terrain toward the city of Derna. The march was brutal. Supplies ran thin, alliances wavered, language barriers complicated coordination. Eaton's force was a patchwork. Greeks, Arabs, American Marines, united less by ideology than by shared objective and promised payment. Desert warfare strips away illusions quickly. Water is strategy. Discipline is survival. Trust is provisional. Eaton gambled that speed and surprise could compensate for limited numbers. In April 1805, his force reached Derna. The attack that followed was swift and chaotic. Naval bombardment from offshore vessels coordinated with ground assault. After intense fighting, Derna fell. The first time the American flag was raised over captured territory in the Old World. It was symbolic, small in scale but immense in implication. The United States had executed an amphibious expeditionary operation thousands of miles from home. To the shores of Tripoli would later enter Marine Corps lore, but in the moment it was less legend than improvisation. The victory unsettled Yusuf Karamanli. His authority was challenged. Internal instability loomed. But instability cuts both ways. Hamet's capacity to govern remained uncertain. Eaton's force was fragile. Sustaining control in hostile territory required reinforcement the United States was reluctant to provide. The war had opened a second front, and second fronts complicate clarity. While Eaton advanced from the east, naval operations continued. Commodore Samuel Barron replaced Preble due to health concerns, introducing new command dynamics. Coordination between sea and land required trust and communication across distance and uncertainty. Meanwhile, negotiations intensified. The Pasha faced pressure. Derna's capture signaled vulnerability. American naval presence signaled endurance. European intermediaries facilitated discussions. Prisoners' lives hung in balance. The United States faced a familiar dilemma in unfamiliar form. Continue escalating to secure total victory, or negotiate partial resolution that preserved dignity but involved payment. Total victory was undefined. Overthrowing the Pasha entirely would require sustained land commitment. Maintaining Derna indefinitely would strain resources. Domestic appetite for prolonged foreign occupation was limited. Jefferson, ever pragmatic beneath ideological framing, leaned toward settlement. In June 1805, a treaty was concluded. Tripoli agreed to release American prisoners. Hostilities ceased. The United States agreed to pay $60,000, framed not as tribute, but as ransom for captives. Language matters. Functionally, money changed hands. Symbolically, tribute had not resumed as a standing obligation. The distinction was subtle but politically vital. Eaton was furious. He believed abandoning Hammett betrayed commitment and squandered leverage. Some officers shared his frustration. They had seized territory, challenged authority, and demonstrated capability, only to see compromise prevail. But Jefferson prioritized closure. The primary objective had been securing commerce without ongoing tribute escalation. That objective was met, imperfectly, but sufficiently. The squadron withdrew. The prisoners returned home. Derna was relinquished. The war, at least for the moment, ended. Yet its imprint lingered. The United States had projected force across an ocean. It had conducted blockade, close-quarters naval combat, clandestine raids, and limited land expedition. It had navigated diplomacy under fire and confronted constitutional ambiguity about executive war powers. Most importantly, it had discovered something about itself. It was capable, not invincible, not dominant, but capable of sustained overseas action when interests demanded it. The Mediterranean racket had tested the young republic's resolve. It had not broken it, but neither had it vanished. Because systems built over centuries do not dissolve after one campaign. They adapt. And so would the United States. When the squadron sailed home in 1805, there were no parades waiting on the docks. There was relief. There was pride in small, sharp moments. Decatur's raid, the stand at Derna, the endurance of sailors who had circled a hostile harbor for months. But there was also ambiguity. Had America won? Tripoli had released its captives. The United States had not agreed to renewed annual tribute. Commerce resumed under improved terms, yet money had still been paid, and Algiers and Tunis were still watching. Peace in the Mediterranean was rarely a clean conclusion. It was a pause negotiated under current conditions. Conditions change. Jefferson reduced naval presence after the treaty. The squadron thinned. Resources shifted. The Republic turned its attention elsewhere. westward expansion, internal politics, tensions with Britain and France. The Mediterranean slipped from urgency to background. But the background was not quiet. Algiers remained powerful. Its ruler understood that America's victory over Tripoli did not automatically translate into dominance across North Africa. Tribute arrangements with Algiers had not disappeared. Payments continued in various forms. Diplomats walked narrow lines between firmness and appeasement. The Barbary system had absorbed a shock, but not collapsed. Meanwhile, Europe descended deeper into the Napoleonic Wars. British and French fleets contested seas with massive scale. Global trade patterns shifted under blockade and counter-blockade. American merchants found themselves squeezed between imperial giants. Neutrality became precarious. In that environment, the Mediterranean question seemed secondary, until it wasn't. By the early 1810s, tensions with Britain intensified dramatically. Impressment of American sailors into the Royal Navy, restrictions on trade, and frontier conflicts pushed the United States toward another war. This time, with a power far more formidable than Tripoli. In 1812, war was declared against Britain. The Mediterranean faded almost entirely from focus. American naval resources concentrated on Atlantic engagements, Great Lakes battles, and coastal defense. Frigates that had once patrolled Tripoli now hunted British ships or defended American harbors. North Africa observed carefully. A republic fighting the world's dominant naval power would not easily sustain distant pressure elsewhere. Opportunity returns when attention divides. During the War of 1812, Algiers began testing American vulnerability again. Tribute disputes resurfaced, captures increased, diplomatic friction sharpened. The logic was familiar. If the United States was fully engaged with Britain, it would hesitate to open another maritime front. And hesitation can be monetized. But something had changed since 1785. The American Navy was no longer experimental. Combat with the Royal Navy, even in limited engagements, had hardened officers and crews. Victories like the USS Constitution over HMS Guerriere and USS United States over HMS Macedonian elevated naval confidence. The Republic had fought one of the strongest fleets in the world and survived. It would not approach Algiers with the same uncertainty as before. When the War of 1812 concluded in early 1815, the United States faced a choice: return to cautious negotiation, or settle the Mediterranean question decisively. President James Madison chose assertion. Congress authorized a squadron under Commodore Stephen Decatur, the same officer who had burned the Philadelphia a decade earlier. This time, the mission was unambiguous: compel Algiers to abandon tribute demands and secure American shipping permanently. There would be no slow blockade, no tentative signaling. Speed would be leverage. In the summer of 1815, Decatur's squadron crossed the Atlantic swiftly. Within days of entering Mediterranean waters, American ships captured the Algerian flagship Mashuda after a sharp engagement. Another vessel, the Estedio, was seized shortly after. The impact was immediate. Algiers had not expected rapid, aggressive action. The United States did not linger offshore testing resolve. It struck first and struck successfully. Decatur sailed directly to Algiers and demanded terms. This was diplomacy backed by visible force. The treaty imposed in 1815 differed markedly from earlier arrangements. The United States would pay no further tribute. Prisoners were released without ransom. American ships were granted full rights to navigate without payment. It was not a request. It was settlement under duress. Tunis and Tripoli, observing Algiers' capitulation, moved quickly to reaffirm agreements with similar terms. The Mediterranean calculus shifted. The United States had demonstrated not only willingness to fight, but capacity to compel. European powers noted the outcome. Britain and the Netherlands later conducted their own bombardments of Algiers to suppress corsair activity more broadly. The Barbary system, already strained by shifting global power dynamics, began to erode more rapidly in the 19th century. American involvement had not destroyed it single-handedly, but it had accelerated its decline. The Second Barbary War was short, decisive, lacking the drawn-out uncertainty of the first conflict. It reflected a nation transformed by experience. In 1785, American sailors had been captured without response capacity. In 1801, the Republic tested limited naval assertion. In 1815, it imposed settlement. The arc was visible. From vulnerability to experimentation to enforcement. Yet even decisive action carries nuance. The United States did not establish colonies in North Africa. It did not annex territory. It did not maintain permanent Mediterranean occupation forces. Its objective was narrower: secure commerce without tribute. Once achieved, it withdrew again. This pattern would define early American foreign policy: assertive when interests were threatened, reluctant to remain entangled beyond necessity. But the psychological shift endured. The nation no longer saw itself as geographically confined. Oceans were not barriers, they were transit routes. Naval force was not an accessory, it was instrument. The Mediterranean wars had clarified that independence did not end at the shoreline. It required maintenance abroad. Sailors who served in those campaigns carried lessons home. Officers refined doctrine. Shipyards improved design. Political leaders gained familiarity with overseas deployment and its domestic implications. The republic that emerged from 1815 was not the same republic that had disarmed in 1783. It had tested its assumptions about tribute, deterrence, and projection. It had learned that protection purchased under pressure breeds more pressure. And it had discovered that measured force, when sustained, can alter long-standing systems. But the deeper lesson ran beneath the treaties and victories. Power unused invites assessment. Power demonstrated reshapes negotiation. The Barbary Wars did not make the United States an empire. They made it a maritime actor. And once a nation learns to act beyond its coast, it never entirely forgets how. Nations rarely recognize turning points while standing inside them. The sailors who hauled lines in the Mediterranean did not speak in terms of doctrine or geopolitical transition. They spoke of rationed water, splintered spars, powder burns, and the relief of mail from home. They measured success in surviving another cruise season. But institutions remember what individuals endure. The early republic entered the Mediterranean uncertain whether it even wanted a navy. It emerged understanding that sea power was not a luxury. It was insulation. Commerce without protection is exposure. Exposure invites leverage. Leverage becomes dependency. That chain of cause and effect had unfolded in real time. The officers who matured during the Barbary conflicts would shape American naval culture for decades. They learned that distant operations require logistics as carefully engineered as ships. They learned that morale erodes faster than hull integrity. They learned that small tactical humiliations can ripple politically across oceans. They also learned that resolve, once displayed consistently, simplifies negotiation. When Decatur demanded terms in 1815, he did so from a position created not in a single battle, but through accumulated credibility. The burning of the Philadelphia, the endurance of blockade, the amphibious assault at Derna, each had contributed to a reputation that could be leveraged. Reputation, like tribute, compounds. But unlike tribute, it can deter rather than invite pressure. The political class absorbed subtler lessons. Executive authority in foreign conflict had stretched beyond clear constitutional boundaries. Jefferson had initiated sustained naval engagement without a formal declaration of war. Congress had funded operations but avoided explicit framing. The ambiguity did not produce crisis at the time, but it established precedent. Presidents could deploy naval force abroad in defense of commerce and national interest without conventional war declarations. Congress could support or criticize without fully owning escalation. This elastic framework would resurface repeatedly in American history. It began not with massive armies, but with frigates off Tripoli. There was also the matter of identity. The United States had long defined itself in contrast to European empires. It rejected monarchy, aristocracy, imperial hierarchy. Yet, in defending its trade, it employed tools familiar to older powers: blockade, bombardment, regime interference. Supporting Hamet Karamanli's claim to power was not colonial annexation, but it was intervention. The Republic justified it as limited and necessary. Intentions matter, so do patterns. The Mediterranean experience showed that American principles would be interpreted through action abroad, not merely rhetoric at home. Meanwhile, the broader world continued shifting. The Ottoman Empire, within whose orbit the Barbary regencies nominally existed, was weakening. European industrial capacity was rising. Naval technology was evolving. Steam power loomed on the horizon, promising to reduce dependence on wind and current. The Corsair system relied on speed and surprise within a narrow maritime ecosystem. As global trade intensified and industrial navies expanded, that ecosystem constricted. The Barbary states had thrived in a world where decentralized maritime predation could extract steady revenue from fragmented European rivals. That world was fading. The United States entered the Mediterranean at the tail end of that era and helped close it. Not alone, but decisively enough to mark transition. Domestically, the wars left quieter marks. Veterans carried stories into taverns and town halls. Newspapers framed engagements as proof that the Republic could defend its honor. The Marine Corps enshrined Derna in institutional memory. Naval officers developed professional pride independent of European validation. The Navy was no longer an experiment justified only by crisis. It was a permanent arm of national policy. Shipbuilding continued, training formalized, strategic thinking expanded beyond coastal defense. The Atlantic was no longer the outer edge of American concern. It was a corridor. And yet, restraint remained part of the equation. After 1815, the United States did not seek to dominate Mediterranean politics. It did not establish garrisons or extract concessions beyond navigational rights. It withdrew once objectives were met. This balance, assertive engagement without territorial ambition, defined early American maritime posture. It would not remain static forever, but in the Barbary era, it held. The wars had been about leverage, not land, about access, not empire, about dignity in commerce, not dominion over people. There is a temptation to frame the Barbary conflicts as minor skirmishes, small-scale episodes overshadowed by larger wars against Britain or internal expansion westward. But scale can mislead. The Revolutionary War secured independence. The War of 1812 affirmed sovereignty against a great power. The Barbary Wars clarified something different: how the United States would behave when challenged far from home. Would it retreat into geography, or extend its reach to defend its interests? It chose extension, cautiously, imperfectly, but unmistakably. The Mediterranean taught that oceans do not neutralize vulnerability, they amplify it. Trade crosses water, so do threats. Distance complicates response, but does not eliminate necessity. By confronting North African regencies, the United States was not chasing glory. It was correcting a structural weakness exposed after independence. Disarmament had been affordable in the short term. Dependence was not. In 1783, the Republic dismantled its navy to reduce cost and avoid militarization. In 1815, it imposed terms across an ocean. Between those dates lies transformation. Not into empire, not into hegemon, but into participant. A nation aware that ideals require infrastructure, that commerce demands protection, that credibility, once challenged, must be demonstrated rather than asserted. The Barbary Wars did not make America powerful overnight. They made it conscious of power. And consciousness is the beginning of strategy. Policies are drafted in quiet rooms. Wars are endured in loud ones. The Barbary conflicts are often summarized through treaties, ship movements, and diplomatic correspondence. But beneath every negotiation was a human ledger, rarely balanced cleanly. The captured sailors from the Philadelphia were not abstractions. They lived in confinement for nearly 2 years. Some were confined in cramped quarters near the harbor. Others were assigned labor. Disease moved easily in captivity. Time stretched. Letters home were censored or delayed. Families waited without certainty. In coastal American towns, mothers and wives tracked fragmentary news from newspapers printed weeks after events. The distance between Tripoli and Boston was not merely geographic, it was informational. Uncertainty is its own form of suffering. American sailors were not the only ones paying cost. Tripolitan defenders endured bombardment from offshore guns. Coastal neighborhoods absorbed damage. Civilians navigated scarcity as blockades disrupted supply routes. Political instability within the Pasha's court created fear of betrayal or overthrow. War in confined maritime cities compresses impact. The same harbor that sustains commerce becomes target. The same walls that protect population attract cannon fire. Neither side experienced total devastation, but neither remained untouched. For the American Navy, the Mediterranean served as crucible. Crews were drawn from varied backgrounds: New England fishermen, southern farmhands, urban laborers, recent immigrants. Many had never traveled beyond coastal waters before crossing the Atlantic. Exposure to foreign ports reshaped perspective. They saw European fleets in concentration. They saw Ottoman fortifications. They saw markets where languages blended and allegiances shifted quickly. They learned that the world was larger and more interconnected than local politics suggested. And they learned that discipline mattered. Extended deployments tested morale. Alcohol rationing, corporal punishment, cramped quarters. These were realities of early naval life. Commanders balanced severity with necessity. A ship at sea is an ecosystem. Disorder spreads rapidly. So does competence. Out of these voyages emerged a professional cadre that would define American naval ethos for generations. There was also moral complexity. American outrage at the enslavement of its sailors rang loud in newspapers. Sermons condemned the barbarity of captivity. Political speeches invoked liberty and dignity. Yet within the United States, chattel slavery persisted. The contradiction was visible to observers abroad and at home. Southern legislators who denounced North African enslavement defended plantation systems domestically. Northern critics noted the irony, though not always loudly. The Barbary Wars did not resolve that hypocrisy, but they exposed it. Freedom, when asserted internationally, invites scrutiny domestically. On the Tripolitan side, corsairs were not faceless villains. They were sailors operating within a long-standing economic structure. Many came from coastal families for whom maritime raiding was tradition. Some were coerced by poverty. Others were motivated by profit and prestige. When American frigates bombarded the harbor, those sailors faced death just as American sailors did. War flattens nuance. History often simplifies participants into caricature, but lived reality resists that compression. William Eaton's Desert March illustrated fragility more than glory. His mercenary force nearly collapsed multiple times. Payment disputes threatened cohesion. Supplies dwindled to critical levels. Leadership disagreements simmered. Had one alliance fractured decisively, the expedition might have dissolved in sand. Instead, it held just long enough to seize Derna. Heroism in hindsight often looks cleaner than it felt in the moment. Back in Washington, political cost accumulated quietly. Funding extended naval operations required revenue. Revenue required taxation. Taxation invited opposition. Federalists and Democratic Republicans clashed over spending priorities and executive authority. Newspapers amplified division. Jefferson's administration walked a narrow path. Maintain resolve abroad without igniting backlash at home. He succeeded partially because the war remained limited. Casualties were real but not massive. Engagements were sharp but contained. The conflict never demanded nationwide mobilization. Had it escalated further, domestic tolerance might have fractured. The Second Barbary War in 1815, though brief, carried its own human imprint. When Decatur captured Algerian vessels, prisoners were taken on both sides. Negotiations involved faces and voices, not merely clauses. The humiliation felt by Algerian leadership mirrored earlier American frustration. Power reversals generate resentment. The decline of the corsair system did not instantly translate into economic alternatives for coastal North African populations. Revenue streams contracted. Political instability deepened in subsequent decades. Every strategic adjustment produces ripple effects. For American society, the wars left quieter imprints in memory and myth. From the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli would later become a line in Marine Corps tradition. Naval heroes entered popular imagination. Young men saw maritime service as pathway to honor. The Mediterranean had shifted from distant hazard to formative chapter. And yet, for many Americans, daily life continued largely unaffected. Farmers harvested crops. Western settlers pushed beyond the Appalachians. Slavery expanded southward. The Republic's internal contradictions deepened, even as it asserted itself abroad. Foreign policy rarely transforms domestic structure immediately, but it alters trajectory. The human cost of the Barbary Wars did not reach the catastrophic scale of later American conflicts. There were no fields lined with thousands of graves, no cities reduced entirely to ash. Instead, the cost was dispersed across decks, prisons, desert marches, political arguments, and quiet anxieties. It was a formative strain rather than a traumatic rupture. And sometimes, formative strains matter more. They teach endurance without overwhelming identity. They reveal limits without shattering confidence. They prepare institutions for larger trials ahead. By 1815, the United States had not become a dominant global power, but it had confronted vulnerability and adjusted. It had paid ransom and burned ships. It had negotiated and bombarded. It had compromised and compelled. And beneath those actions were individuals. Sailors gripping ropes in Mediterranean heat. Prisoners staring through barred windows. Diplomats calculating language. Rulers measuring risk. History often compresses such experiences into neat arcs. But the arc of the Barbary Wars was built from human endurance, layered slowly over time. And that layering changed a nation more than any single cannon blast. When American frigates first appeared in Mediterranean waters, European powers watched with restrained curiosity. When those frigates began firing, curiosity sharpened. For centuries, the Barbary states had existed within a diplomatic ecosystem shaped largely by Europe. Britain, France, Spain, and the Netherlands had long histories of paying tribute, conducting punitive expeditions, or negotiating fluctuating arrangements. None viewed the system as admirable. Most viewed it as manageable. The arrival of the United States disrupted that pattern. Here was a young republic with limited naval experience, limited revenue, and limited global alliances. Yet it was choosing confrontation over accommodation. That decision registered. European diplomats stationed in North Africa reported American actions to their courts. They noted the destruction of the Philadelphia. They recorded Decatur's audacity. They observed Jefferson's refusal to expand tribute payments beyond existing agreements. The message was not that America was powerful. The message was that America was willing. And willingness alters calculations. Britain's perspective was layered. On one level, the Royal Navy remained the dominant maritime force of the era. American naval operations posed no strategic threat to British supremacy. Yet Britain understood something about maritime resolve. It recognized that even limited fleets, if sustained politically, could project disproportionate influence. The British also observed American naval development closely after the War of 1812. When Decatur sailed against Algiers in 1815, the Royal Navy had just concluded years of total war against Napoleon. Europe was recalibrating. American enforcement against Algiers demonstrated that the United States would not revert to passivity after defeating Britain at sea in isolated engagements. It intended to defend its commercial lanes independently. That mattered. France's view was similarly complex. French policy toward the Barbary states had oscillated for decades. Commercial interests, Mediterranean strategy, and domestic instability shaped its approach. By the early 19th century, France was already envisioning expanded influence in North Africa, a vision that would culminate in the invasion of Algeria in 1830. American action did not cause French colonial ambitions, but it revealed vulnerability within the corsair system. When a distant republic could compel treaty concessions, it signaled that the old equilibrium was weakening. Empires notice weakness. Spain and smaller European maritime powers, long accustomed to intermittent raiding, viewed American insistence on non-payment with cautious intrigue. Tribute had been normalized as a cost of doing business. It was inconvenient but predictable. The United States challenged that normalization. And once precedent shifts, expectations begin to shift with it. If one power resists successfully, others reconsider. There is a temptation to frame the Barbary Wars as isolated episodes confined to bilateral relations. They were not. They intersected with a broader transformation in international maritime law and practice. The 18th century had tolerated privateering and tribute systems as embedded realities. The 19th century increasingly sought standardized rules. The Congress of Vienna in 1815 reshaped European borders and political alignments after Napoleon's defeat. Amid that restructuring, maritime security became part of the diplomatic conversation. Suppression of piracy gained greater legitimacy as shared interest rather than unilateral grievance. American actions fed into that evolving consensus, not as the sole driver, but as a visible example. Within the Ottoman Empire, under whose nominal authority the Barbary states operated, the signal was subtler but significant. The semi-autonomous North African provinces had long balanced between local autonomy and imperial affiliation. External pressure from European fleets had already eroded their leverage. American naval intervention added another external variable. It demonstrated that distant non-European states could exert force in Ottoman-adjacent waters without formal colonial ambition. That dynamic complicated imperial authority and local governance simultaneously. Power was fragmenting and centralizing in unpredictable ways. Commercial networks responded quickly. Insurance rates for American merchant ships in Mediterranean routes fluctuated during conflict periods. European insurers tracked outcomes closely. As the corsair threat diminished after 1815, commercial confidence increased. Trade volume reflects perceived stability. When American vessels sailed with reduced risk of capture, it signaled to partners that the Republic could protect its interests abroad. Merchants in Livorno, Marseille, and Cadiz recalibrated their assumptions about American reliability. Reputation in trade is currency. The ripple effect also touched diplomacy beyond North Africa. When the United States negotiated with European states in subsequent decades, it did so with a record of having defended its commerce by force when necessary. That record altered tone. It did not erase asymmetry between the United States and established empires, but it narrowed the psychological gap. Nations are judged not only by size, but by behavior. Consistency under pressure builds credibility. By the mid-19th century, global anti-piracy efforts expanded. European navies targeted slave-trading vessels along the West African coast. International agreements increasingly defined piracy as a universal crime rather than a negotiable enterprise. The Barbary corsair system gradually faded into historical memory. It did not disappear overnight. Economic realities, internal reform movements, and eventual European colonization all contributed to its decline. But the wars with the United States marked a visible inflection point. They signaled that tribute-based maritime coercion faced mounting resistance. There is irony in the trajectory. A republic born in anti-imperial revolution found itself projecting force across an ocean to secure commerce. It did so without claiming territory. It withdrew after achieving treaty objectives. That distinction separated the Barbary Wars from later colonial ventures undertaken by European powers. Yet the projection itself, ships, guns, marines on foreign shores, established precedent. Precedent is subtle. It does not compel future action, but it makes future action imaginable. European observers, diplomats, and strategists absorbed that lesson. The United States was not content to remain a peripheral Atlantic nation. It would cross oceans when interests demanded. It would negotiate when possible. It would fight when necessary. And it would do so without seeking formal empire. At least, not yet. The ripple that began with a handful of frigates extended far beyond Tripoli's harbour. It entered chancelleries, insurance offices, naval academies, and parliamentary debates. It reshaped perception. And perception, in international affairs, often precedes transformation. Wars do not always produce doctrines immediately. Sometimes they leave impressions that only later harden into principle. The Barbary conflicts did exactly that. At the moment of confrontation, American leaders were not articulating sweeping strategic theories. They were reacting to seized ships, to ransom demands, to diplomatic humiliation. Yet through reaction, a pattern formed. The United States would defend its commercial rights abroad. It would resist perpetual tribute. It would use naval power as instrument of negotiation rather than conquest. That pattern would echo. Thomas Jefferson did not call it a doctrine. He framed it as necessity. But the idea that a republic could project force overseas without abandoning its republican identity became a foundational tension in American statecraft. The Barbary Wars were the first sustained test of that tension. Isolation had limits. Commerce created exposure. Exposure demanded protection. Protection required power. The equation was simple in structure, complicated in consequence. The Constitution had granted Congress authority to declare war, to fund navies, to regulate commerce. Yet the execution of military operations required executive initiative. Jefferson's decision to dispatch squadrons without a formal declaration of war generated debate but not collapse. The Republic discovered that limited military engagement could occur within constitutional bounds. Precedent accumulated quietly. Later presidents would cite earlier actions when asserting authority to protect American interests abroad without full declarations. The seeds of executive flexibility were planted in Mediterranean waters, not through sweeping rhetoric, through practice. Naval construction also gained philosophical weight. The earlier debate between standing fleets and temporary mobilization shifted. The effectiveness of the frigates, Constitution, United States, Constellation, validated investment in quality over quantity. These ships were not numerous, but they were formidable. American shipbuilding gained reputation. Oak hulls, heavy guns, disciplined crews. These became symbols of capability disproportionate to fleet size. From this experience emerged a belief that strategic deterrence did not require massive armadas if technological and tactical superiority compensated. That belief would reappear repeatedly in American defense planning. The Marines, too, absorbed identity. The phrase, later embedded in their hymn referencing the shores of Tripoli, was not poetic flourish detached from reality. It memorialized expeditionary action in a foreign desert city seized by a hybrid force of Americans and local allies. It affirmed that small, mobile units could achieve political effect beyond their numbers. Expeditionary capability became part of institutional DNA. Not because of grand theoretical formulation, because it had worked. There was also the matter of commerce itself. The early republic depended heavily on maritime trade. Agricultural exports, imported manufactured goods, insurance markets, all interlocked. The vulnerability exposed by Barbary piracy clarified that economic growth and naval power were inseparable. Free trade without security proved illusory. This realization would influence American policy in subsequent decades as commercial interests expanded toward Asia and the Pacific. Protection of trade routes became recurring justification for presence. The Mediterranean had been rehearsal. The Barbary Wars also complicated the narrative of American exceptionalism. The Republic had rebelled against empire, yet it now exercised coercion overseas. It opposed tribute, yet imposed demands by force. It decried enslavement of its sailors while tolerating slavery within its own borders. Doctrine rarely resolves contradiction. It manages it. The emerging American approach did not claim moral perfection. It claimed practical legitimacy, the right to defend citizens and commerce against coercion. Whether that claim aligned consistently with domestic values remained unsettled, and would remain unsettled for generations. In strategic terms, the wars reinforced the utility of limited objectives. The United States did not attempt regime change in Tripoli, beyond supporting a rival claimant as leverage. It did not annex territory. It did not maintain permanent occupation. Object. Ives were concrete. Secure release of prisoners. End tribute demands. Protect shipping. Once achieved, forces withdrew. This model of limited war would recur, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. But its early demonstration offered policymakers a template for restrained engagement. Restraint is easier to describe than to sustain. Yet in this instance, it held. The Second Barbary War in 1815 sharpened the doctrine further. Swift deployment, decisive action. Clear demands, immediate treaty. The campaign lasted weeks, not years. Its brevity reinforced confidence that concentrated force could compel compliance without prolonged entanglement. Speed became part of the lesson. Delay benefits defenders. Momentum benefits challengers. Over time, these experiences merged into a broader strategic posture. Avoid European political entanglements while maintaining capacity to defend global commerce. It was not isolationism in pure form. It was selective engagement. The Atlantic and Mediterranean were proving grounds. Later theaters would expand outward. Caribbean, Pacific, Asia. Each expansion would draw faint lineage back to those early voyages. Doctrine is rarely born fully formed. It emerges from accumulated decisions under pressure. The Barbary Wars provided first data points in a long experiment. How a republic navigates power beyond its shores without losing itself. There was no certainty that balance would endure, only precedent. And precedent, once established, tends to guide imagination. By the close of these conflicts, The United States had not articulated a grand maritime strategy in formal treatises, but it had practiced one. And practice, more than proclamation, shapes the future. When the guns fell silent and the treaties were signed, the Barbary Wars did not vanish. They settled into memory. But memory is selective. In the decades that followed, Americans would fight far larger wars, against Britain again in 1812, against Mexico, against themselves in civil war. Compared to those convulsions, the Mediterranean campaigns seemed small. Limited casualties, distant geography, contained objectives. Yet small wars often leave outsized symbolic weight. The image of a young republic standing firm against coercion fit neatly into national self-understanding. Schoolbooks later condensed complex diplomacy into cleaner lines. Pirates demand tribute. America refuses. Navy triumphs. The reality had been messier. Negotiations, partial payments, strategic compromises. But myth prefers clarity. And clarity travels well. The figure of Stephen Decatur grew in reputation long after the smoke cleared. His daring raid to destroy the captured frigate became emblem of bold initiative. His later declaration, "Our country, right or wrong," echoed into future debates about loyalty and dissent. William Eaton's Desert March entered law as proof of American resolve in unfamiliar terrain. The capture of Derna acquired dramatic framing. A small force crossing hostile landscape to plant a flag on distant walls. These stories were not fabricated, but they were streamlined. Complex motives and fragile alliances faded from popular telling. Heroism remained. Nations tend to elevate moments that confirm identity. The Barbary Wars confirmed that Americans could operate on a global stage without imperial masters guiding them. That mattered deeply in the early 19th century. Within the United States Navy, tradition crystallized. Officers studied Mediterranean engagements as case examples. Seamanship, gunnery discipline, blockade tactics. These were analyzed not only as history, but as instruction. The idea that American crews could match or outperform seasoned European and North African sailors reinforced institutional confidence. Confidence breeds continuity. The Navy began to see itself not as experimental arm of a hesitant republic, but as permanent instrument of policy. Identity stabilized. In North Africa, memory took a different form. For the rulers of Tripoli, Tunis, and Algiers, the early 19th century marked a period of mounting pressure. The United States was one of several external forces challenging established practices. European fleets would intensify that pressure in subsequent decades, culminating in colonization. From their perspective, the American campaigns were not mythic assertions of liberty. They were episodes in a broader pattern of Western encroachment. Historical memory diverges according to vantage point. What one nation frames as principled defense, another may record as intrusion. Neither perspective exists in isolation. As time advanced, the Barbary Wars drifted towards symbolic shorthand rather than detailed recollection. The line in the Marine Corps hymn endured. The names of ships, Constitution, Philadelphia, Enterprise, retained resonance. But the political debates, the ransom negotiations, the uneasy compromises, faded into archival quiet. That fading carries risk. When complexity disappears from memory, lessons flatten. The wars were not pure triumph nor humiliating defeat. They were incremental adjustment. a republic learning how to exist in a world shaped by older powers and entrenched systems. Memory also intersects with morality. The contradiction between denouncing enslavement abroad while permitting slavery at home became starker as sectional tensions grew. Later generations looking backward could not ignore that dissonance. The Barbary Wars did not resolve it, but they sit within that tension. Early assertion of freedom constrained by incomplete application. History does not offer comfort by smoothing such edges. It presents them plainly. By the late 19th century, as the United States expanded its reach into the Pacific and Caribbean, commentators occasionally invoked earlier Mediterranean actions as precedent. They argued that overseas operations were not novel departures, but extensions of established practice. Precedent can legitimize ambition. It can also obscure difference. The limited objectives of the Barbary campaigns differed significantly from later territorial acquisitions. Yet, invocation blurred distinction. Myth compresses nuance into usable narrative. Today, the Barbary Wars occupy a space between obscurity and symbolism. They are rarely central in popular discussion, yet they surface whenever questions arise about early American foreign policy, executive power, or naval tradition. They remind observers that the United States confronted global challenges long before it became a global superpower. And they reveal that the tension between principle and pragmatism existed from the beginning. Memory preserves not only what happened, but how it is interpreted. And interpretation shapes future action as surely as canon once did. The story that began with vulnerable merchant ships ended with a republic altered. Not transformed into empire, not elevated instantly to dominance, but steadied. At independence, the United States possessed ambition without infrastructure. By 1815, it possessed tested naval capacity and a clearer sense of its limits. That clarity mattered more than triumph. The Mediterranean had exposed fragility. It had also revealed resilience. American leaders learned that distance did not exempt them from international systems. Commerce intertwined them with regions shaped by centuries of conflict and negotiation. Withdrawal was illusion. Engagement was inevitable. The question was not whether to participate in global affairs, but how. The Barbary Wars provided early answers. Project force when negotiation fails. Define objectives narrowly. Withdraw when those objectives are secured. Maintain naval readiness even in peacetime. Accept that moral claims invite scrutiny of domestic practice. These were not codified commandments. They were habits formed under pressure. Habits endure. There is temptation to romanticize the simplicity of that era. Wooden ships, clear enemies, contained conflicts. But simplicity is retrospective. At the time, uncertainty dominated. Jefferson could not know whether limited deployment would spiral into broader war. Sailors boarding hostile decks could not predict whether reinforcements would arrive. Diplomats signing treaties could not guarantee compliance beyond immediate horizon. Decision-makers operated with partial information. They still do. The difference lies in scale, not in essence. The republic that emerged from these conflicts retained its contradictions. Slavery remained entrenched. Political factions continued to clash. Expansion westward intensified debates about identity and power. The Barbary Wars did not resolve internal fractures. They did, however, demonstrate external competence. And external competence can stabilize internal confidence, at least temporarily. Nations, like individuals, draw strength from moments when action aligns with intention. Across the Atlantic, the old corsair system declined under combined pressure of reform, economic change, and European intervention. The Mediterranean shifted toward new patterns of control and commerce. Colonial ambitions would soon reshape North Africa, far more drastically than American naval expeditions ever did. The United States did not remain absent from global power struggles. Over the next century, it would expand territory, project influence, and wrestle repeatedly with the tension between principle and power, first tested off Tripoli's coast. The Barbary Wars were not culmination. They were prologue. If one traces a line from those early frigates to later fleets crossing oceans in larger conflicts, the continuity is visible. Not in scale of force, but in mindset. A willingness to defend maritime rights. A belief that commerce and security are intertwined. A recognition that ideals require enforcement to endure. These convictions, once tentative, became embedded. Yet the enduring lesson may be subtler. The United States learned that strength need not manifest as occupation, that objectives can be limited, that withdrawal can follow success. History would test those lessons repeatedly, sometimes harshly, but their origin remains in those first overseas campaigns. A republic steps beyond its shore only once for the first time. When American sails appeared on the Mediterranean horizon at the dawn of the 19th century, they carried uncertainty, vulnerability, and resolve in equal measure. By the time they departed, they carried experience. Experience is not as dramatic as victory. It does not inspire songs as easily as conquest, but it shapes nations more profoundly. The Barbary Wars were a proving ground of ships, of leaders, of constitutional boundaries, of moral claims. From that proving ground emerged a country more aware of its place in the world. Not dominant, not flawless, but prepared. And preparation, more than triumph, defined America's first overseas war.